My name is Stephanie, and I'm 24 years old. 2 weeks ago, my parents called me asking why I hadn't started college yet. I stood in my childhood bedroom, staring at my acceptance letter to State University, and told them the truth they somehow forgot. 6 months earlier, they had emptied my college savings account that I'd spent 4 years building, taking every single dollar of my $32,000 to fund my sister's fairy tale wedding. Now they were acting confused, demanding I figure out my education myself because, as they put it, family comes first. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever felt overlooked in your family, and don't forget to subscribe because trust me, this journey of standing up to family betrayal is just getting started. You won't believe what happens next. Growing up in our household was like living in a monarchy where I was never in line for the throne. My sister Brittany, just 2 years older than me, had been crowned the family princess from birth, while I existed as some kind of forgotten middle child despite being the youngest. The favoritism wasn't subtle or hidden. It was as obvious as the designer clothes Brittany wore to school while I made do with hand-me-downs and thrift store finds. When Brittany turned 8, our parents enrolled her in piano lessons, ballet classes, and art workshops. When I turned 8 and asked for the same opportunities, they told me we couldn't afford it. Instead, they suggested I help out at Dad's auto shop on weekends to earn spending money. By age 16, I was working 3 jobs, serving tables at Rosie's Diner on weekends, tutoring younger kids in math after school, and stocking shelves at the local grocery store during summer breaks. Every dollar I earned went into my college savings account, carefully deposited and tracked in a notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. Meanwhile, Brittany floated through high school without ever holding a job. When she needed money for prom dress, shoes, or makeup, our parents provided it instantly. When I needed new sneakers for my restaurant job, I had to save up for 3 weeks. The message was crystal clear. Brittany's happiness and success were investments worth making, while my dreams were luxuries I'd have to fund myself. Our parents weren't cruel exactly, but their neglect felt calculated. They attended every single one of Brittany's school plays and choir concerts, but somehow always had conflicts when I received academic awards or made the honor roll. They displayed her artwork on the refrigerator and bragged to neighbors about her talent, but my report cards with straight A's got filed away without comment. I learned early that love in our house was conditional and unequally distributed. The college savings plan became my obsession and my escape route. Every night after homework, I'd count my tips from the restaurant, add up my tutoring payments, and calculate how many months until I'd have enough for 4 years of tuition, room, and board. The number grew slowly but steadily, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. By my senior year of high school, I had $28,000 saved, and my parents finally seemed to notice my determination. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," my mother said when I showed her my savings account balance. "We're so proud of you for being responsible." For a brief moment, I thought they might actually contribute something to help me reach my goal. Instead, they asked detailed questions about which bank I used, what type of account it was, and whether they were still listed as co-signers from when I'd opened it as a minor. I answered honestly, still naive enough to believe they were showing genuine interest in my future. 6 months ago, everything changed. Brittany came home from her job at an art gallery with a diamond ring on her finger and tears of joy streaming down her face. She'd gotten engaged to Marcus, a lawyer from a wealthy family who drove expensive cars and wore custom suits. Our parents erupted in celebration, immediately planning engagement parties and discussing wedding venues. Brittany had found her prince, and our family's focus shifted entirely to ensuring her happily ever after. The wedding planning consumed our household. Every conversation revolved around flowers, catering, photography, and venues. Brittany had her heart set on the grand ballroom at the Riverside Hotel, a venue that cost $12,000 just for the rental. The catering for 200 guests would cost another $15,000. Her dream dress cost $4,000. The flowers, music, photography, and decorations added up quickly, and soon we were looking at a $50,000 celebration. Marcus's family was wealthy but conservative with money. They offered to pay for the rehearsal dinner and the honeymoon, but they drew the line at funding what they called unnecessary extravagance. This left our middle-class parents staring at a $40,000 gap between their savings and Brittany's dream wedding. That's when the questions about my college fund began. Hypothetically, my father asked one evening while I was doing homework, if someone in the family had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity but needed financial help, would you consider that more important than something that could be delayed a year or two? I should have seen the trap being laid, but I was too focused on my calculus problems to think deeply about his words. I guess it would depend on the situation, I replied, still scribbling equations. That answer would haunt me for months to come. The acceptance letter from State University arrived on a Tuesday in March, and I'd never felt happier in my entire life. For years of sacrifice, sleepless nights working multiple jobs, and careful saving had finally paid off. I burst into the kitchen waving the letter like a victory flag, and for once, my parents seemed genuinely excited about one of my achievements. My mother hugged me tight and said she knew I'd get in. My father patted my back and talked about how proud he was of my hard work. Even Brittany, deep in wedding planning mode, looked up from her venue catalogs long enough to congratulate me. "We should celebrate," my mother suggested. "Why don't you check your savings balance and see exactly how much you've got? Then we can figure out the final numbers and maybe take you shopping for dorm room supplies." I practically skipped to the bank that afternoon, filled with excitement about finally seeing all my years of work pay off. The teller smiled as she pulled up my account information, but her expression quickly changed to confusion. "I'm showing a balance of $47.33, she said, double-checking her screen. I laughed, thinking there must be some mistake. I'd checked my balance just 2 weeks earlier and had $32,400 saved. Surely there was a computer error or my account information had gotten mixed up with someone else's. But there was no error. Over the past 6 weeks, a series of large withdrawals had systematically emptied my account. $15,000 on March 1st. $10,000 on March 8th. $7,000 on March 15th. The final withdrawal of $400 had happened just 3 days earlier. Every transaction was authorized by the co-signers on my account, my parents, who had used their legal access to steal my entire college fund. I drove home in a daze, the acceptance letter now feeling heavy in my hands instead of light with possibility. When I confronted my parents, they were ready with a rehearsed explanation that sounded like they'd been practicing it for weeks. They sat me down at the kitchen table with serious expressions and explained that there had been a family emergency requiring immediate access to funds. They promised this was just temporary borrowing and swore they'd pay me back with interest before college started in the fall. "What kind of emergency costs $32,000? I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. They exchanged glances before my mother launched into a story about unexpected wedding expenses that couldn't be delayed. The venue required full payment up front to hold Brittany's date. The caterer demanded a deposit immediately or they'd lose their slot. The florist needed money for special order arrangements. Every expense was painted as urgent and unavoidable. "Brittany only gets one chance at the perfect wedding," my father explained. "College will always be there, but you can't recreate a wedding day." They assured me that Marcus's family would eventually contribute more money, and they'd use that to repay my fund. In the meantime, couldn't I delay college for just 1 year? Wouldn't I want to support my sister's happiness? Wasn't family more important than personal ambition? The guilt-tripping was immediate and intense. They painted me as selfish for being upset about money when my sister's lifelong dreams were at stake. They reminded me of all the times Brittany had shared her clothes with me or helped me with homework, conveniently forgetting that I'd been forced to share while she'd always had her own. They talked about family loyalty and sacrifice, making it sound like questioning their decision was a betrayal of everything we stood for. When Brittany came home that evening and learned about my discovery, she burst into tears that seemed calculated rather than genuine. She sobbed about how sorry she was, but explained that she'd had no idea the money would come from my college fund. Our parents had simply told her they'd figured out the wedding finances, and she'd been too excited to ask for details. Now that her invitations were sent and deposits were paid, canceling would be impossible. People were flying in from across the country. Vendors had been booked. Dresses had been ordered. Surely I understood that backing out now would ruin not just her wedding, but her entire relationship with Marcus's family. "I'll pay you back myself after the honeymoon," she promised through crocodile tears. "Marcus and I both have good jobs now, and we'll make this right. You'll have your money back before you know it." She hugged me tight and whispered about how much she loved me, how grateful she was for my sacrifice, and how she'd never forget what I'd done for her happiness. For a moment, I almost believed that maybe this could work out, that maybe my family really would make things right. But as the days passed and I saw the final wedding expenses rolling in, I realized the full scope of what had been stolen from me. The money wasn't just going to essential wedding costs. Brittany had upgraded everything to the most expensive options available. Instead of a simple wedding cake, she'd ordered a 5-tier creation with custom sugar flowers that cost $1,800. Instead of basic floral arrangements, she'd chosen exotic orchids and roses that cost over $3,000. The photography package included engagement photos, wedding day coverage, and a custom album that cost more than most people's cars. My $32,000 had been absorbed into a celebration of excess that went far beyond what any reasonable person would consider necessary. And now my parents expected me to smile, support their decision, and figure out my own future without their help. The first thing I did was research my legal options, spending hours in the public library reading about financial fraud, theft, and parental rights over minors' accounts. What I discovered was devastating. Because my parents were listed as co-signers on my savings account from when I'd opened it at 16, they had legal access to withdraw any amount at any time. The bank wouldn't even consider it theft since they were authorized users. My years of hard work had essentially been legal for them to steal. I consulted with a free legal aid attorney who confirmed my worst fears. While my situation was morally reprehensible, it wasn't technically criminal. My parents had used their legal authority as co-signers, and since I was no longer a minor, I should have removed them from the account if I wanted exclusive control. The lawyer suggested I could pursue civil litigation for conversion of assets, but the costs would likely exceed any potential recovery, especially since my parents' assets were limited. Armed with this information, I demanded a family meeting. I presented my legal research and made it clear that while they might have acted within the law, they had committed a profound betrayal of trust. I wanted a written repayment plan with specific dates and interest calculations. I wanted acknowledgement that they had stolen from me. And I wanted assurance that nothing like this would ever happen again. The meeting didn't go as I'd hoped. Instead of showing remorse or concern for my future, my parents became defensive and angry. They accused me of being ungrateful and selfish. They said I was trying to destroy Brittany's happiness out of jealousy. My father actually said that I should be proud to contribute to my sister's special day, and my mother added that real family members sacrifice for each other without keeping score. Then came the revelation that shattered any remaining illusions about their intentions. This wasn't a desperate decision made under pressure. They'd been planning it for months. My mother admitted they'd discussed using my college fund as soon as Brittany announced her engagement. They'd researched the legal aspects and determined they could access the money without consequences. They'd even calculated how much they needed and decided my entire savings would be sufficient for their purposes. "Brittany deserves this happiness," my father declared. "She's always been the special one in this family, and we're not going to let her settle for less than perfect because you're too selfish to help out." The mask had finally come off. After years of subtle favoritism, they were openly admitting that Brittany's dreams mattered more than mine. They saw her as an investment worth protecting and me as a resource to be exploited. When I refused to accept their justifications and demanded repayment, they escalated their emotional manipulation. They called my aunts and uncles, telling a twisted version of events where I was the villain trying to ruin Brittany's wedding. They spoke to my grandparents, painting me as ungrateful and greedy. They even talked to people at our church, seeking support for their decision and painting my objections as selfishness. Most of my extended family bought their story completely. Aunt Linda called to lecture me about family loyalty. Cousin Sarah posted on social media about how weddings are once-in-a-lifetime events that deserve family support. My grandmother sent a card explaining that when she was young, families helped each other without expecting repayment, and maybe I should be more grateful for everything my parents had provided over the years. The isolation was almost worse than the theft itself. People I'd known my entire life were turning against me based on my parents' propaganda campaign. They were being told that I had plenty of money saved and was simply being greedy, or that I was jealous of Brittany's success and trying to sabotage her happiness. None of them bothered to ask for my side of the story or question why loving parents would steal their daughter's entire college fund. But there was one exception. Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother, called me privately after hearing the family gossip. Instead of lecturing me about gratitude, he asked detailed questions about what had actually happened. When I explained the real situation, he was quiet for a long moment before sharing something that changed everything. "This isn't the first time your parents have done something like this," he said quietly. 15 years ago, when our mother died, they were supposed to split her inheritance with me. They convinced me to let them handle the estate paperwork, and somehow most of my share disappeared into administrative costs and debt payments that were never properly documented. I was younger then and didn't fight it, but I've regretted that decision ever since. Uncle Robert offered to help me research my options and even suggested we could work together to uncover the truth about both situations. He'd been successful in his own business and had resources to fight back that I lacked. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt like someone was actually on my side. My parents' ultimatum came a week later. They called another family meeting, but this time their tone was threatening rather than manipulative. Either I needed to forgive and forget their decision and support Brittany's wedding with enthusiasm, or they would cut me off from the family completely. No more living in their house. No more family events. No more relationship with them or Brittany. They were forcing me to choose between my future and my family. I looked around the living room where I'd grown up, at the photos covering every surface that showed Brittany's achievements while barely including me. I thought about all the times I'd been overlooked, ignored, or treated as less important than my sister. I considered the years I'd spent working multiple jobs while she enjoyed a carefree adolescence funded by our parents' favoritism. "I choose my future," I said quietly. "And I choose to surround myself with people who actually care about my well-being rather than people who see me as a resource to exploit." The words felt powerful coming out of my mouth, even as my mother started crying and my father's face turned red with anger. They'd expected me to cave under pressure like I always had before. Instead, I was finally standing up for myself, and they didn't know how to respond to this version of their daughter who refused to be a victim anymore. Despite everything that had happened, my parents insisted I attend Brittany's wedding and act like a supportive sister. They made it clear that my absence would confirm to everyone that I was selfish and jealous, further damaging my reputation within our extended family. Reluctantly, I agreed to go, but I was determined to document every bit of excess and waste that my stolen money had funded. The morning of the wedding, I arrived at the venue to help with setup and was immediately struck by the opulence that my college dreams had purchased. The grand ballroom had been transformed into what looked like a movie set, with thousands of dollars worth of flowers creating elaborate archways and centerpieces. Crystal chandeliers had been specially cleaned and polished. Custom linens and ivory and gold covered every surface. Even the chairs had been wrapped in expensive fabric with hand-tied bows. I watched vendors arriving throughout the morning, each one representing another chunk of my savings account. The florist alone had brought 3 trucks worth of arrangements, including a bridal arch made from white roses and orchids that I later learned cost $4,000 by itself. The photographer showed up with 2 assistants and enough equipment to film a documentary. The string quartet was setting up in the corner, their instruments probably worth more than most people's annual salaries. But it was the behind-the-scenes chaos that really opened my eyes to how my money had been wasted. Brittany was in full bridezilla mode, screaming at vendors about minor imperfections and demanding last-minute changes that cost hundreds of additional dollars. When the florist mentioned that one of her boutonnieres had a slightly wilted petal, she insisted they replace the entire arrangement at a cost of $200. When the caterer asked about dietary restrictions for guests, she upgraded the menu to include lobster tails for everyone, adding another $3,000 to the bill. I documented everything with my phone, taking photos of price lists and receipts that vendors left lying around. I recorded conversations where Brittany casually mentioned costs that would have covered my textbooks for an entire semester. I watched my parents frantically making additional payments for upgrades and changes that went far beyond the original budget. My $32,000 hadn't been enough after all, and they were now dipping into their retirement savings to fund Brittany's fantasies. The most revealing moment came when I overheard Marcus's mother talking to his father near the gift table. "I can't believe they spent this much money on one party," she whispered. "Our original offer to pay for half would have covered a beautiful, elegant wedding. This is just showing off." His father nodded grimly and responded, "I'm starting to understand why Marcus was hesitant about this family. The financial irresponsibility is concerning." Brittany's new in-laws were actually embarrassed by the display of excess that my stolen money had funded. They would have preferred a more modest celebration that focused on love and family rather than impressing people with expensive decorations and food. All of my sacrifice had gone toward creating a wedding that even the groom's wealthy family found distasteful and inappropriate. During the photography session, I experienced another layer of humiliation that made my status in the family crystal clear. The photographer was taking formal family portraits, and I naturally moved to stand with my parents and sister for what I assumed would be the immediate family shot. My mother quickly pulled me aside and explained that they'd decided to take just parents and bride photos first, then add me in later for extended family pictures. I stood behind the photographer and watched my parents beam with pride as they posed with their golden child, the daughter whose happiness was worth destroying my future. When it was finally time for me to join the photos, I was positioned at the edge of every shot, almost like an afterthought or distant relative rather than an immediate family member. Looking at those photos later, you'd never guess that I was Brittany's sister or that my money had paid for everything surrounding us. The reception was even worse. My parents had reserved a special table near the front for immediate family, but when I went to sit down, I discovered they'd given my seat to Marcus's aunt from Colorado. I was relegated to a table in the back with family friends and distant cousins, people who barely knew me and spent the evening asking why I wasn't in college yet like other kids my age. During the speeches, my parents stood up to toast their daughter and spoke eloquently about her beauty, intelligence, and promising future with Marcus. They talked about how proud they were of her accomplishments and how excited they were to welcome Marcus into the family. They mentioned the family effort that had made this beautiful celebration possible but never acknowledged my specific sacrifice or contribution. I sat at my back table listening to them take credit for providing their daughter's dream wedding without mentioning that they'd stolen from their other daughter to do it. The final insult came during the bouquet toss. Brittany made a big show of looking around the room for single women to participate, and her eyes landed on me with a smirk that made my stomach turn. "Come on, Stephanie," she called out loudly. "You need all the help you can get finding someone willing to put up with you." The entire room laughed, thinking it was playful sister teasing, but I heard the cruelty underneath her words. I participated in the ridiculous tradition, standing with a group of women hoping to catch flowers that my stolen money had purchased, surrounded by decorations that my savings had funded, celebrating a marriage that had cost me my future. When the bouquet landed in my hands, Brittany laughed and said, "Well, maybe now you'll stop being so bitter about everything and focus on finding your own happiness instead of trying to ruin mine." That night, as I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by photos of the wedding excess I'd unwillingly funded, I made a vow that would change everything. I wasn't going to let this injustice stand. I wasn't going to accept being treated like a second-class family member whose dreams didn't matter. I was going to fight back with everything I had, and I was going to make sure there were real consequences for what they'd done to me. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. September arrived with the familiar excitement of back-to-school season, but for me it brought only heartbreak and frustration. I watched my former classmates posting photos from college dorms, orientation activities, and new friendships while I remained trapped at home, my dreams deferred indefinitely. The State University Business Administration program had started without me, and my spot had been given to someone from the waiting list. For years of perfect grades and careful planning had been wasted because my parents had decided my sister's party was more important than my education. That's when my parents pulled their most manipulative stunt yet. 2 weeks after classes had begun, they called me into the living room with expressions of genuine confusion and concern. "Sweetie," my mother said softly, "we're worried about you. Everyone expected you to be in college by now, and people are starting to ask questions. What's your plan for moving forward with your education?" I stared at them in disbelief. They were acting as if my current situation was some mysterious problem that had appeared out of nowhere, rather than the direct result of their theft. They seemed genuinely surprised that I hadn't magically found $32,000 to replace what they'd stolen. My father even suggested that maybe I hadn't been proactive enough in seeking financial aid or scholarship opportunities. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. They'd systematically destroyed my college plans, then waited just long enough for the immediate connection to their actions to fade before expressing concern about my lack of progress. They were rewriting history in real time, positioning themselves as loving parents worried about their daughter's lack of ambition rather than the thieves who had stolen her future. When I reminded them about the stolen tuition money, they dismissed it as dwelling on the past and suggested I should be more focused on solutions rather than blame. They'd convinced themselves that taking my money had been justified and reasonable, and now they expected me to somehow bootstrap my way into college without the resources they'd stolen from me. My attempts to secure financial aid revealed another cruel irony. Because my parents earned a combined $68,000 annually, I didn't qualify for most need-based assistance programs. On paper, our family had sufficient resources to pay for college expenses. The financial aid office had no way of knowing that my parents had chosen to spend my college fund on my sister's wedding instead. Their income disqualified me from help, but their priorities had left me without access to the resources that income should have provided. Meanwhile, Brittany was documenting her luxurious honeymoon across social media, posting photos from expensive restaurants in Paris and designer shopping trips in Milan. Every image felt like salt in my wounds, showing me exactly where my stolen money had gone. She and Marcus were staying in 5-star hotels and taking helicopter tours while I was working double shifts at the restaurant, trying to rebuild my savings $1 at a time. The economic reality of my situation was crushing. Working 25 hours per week at minimum wage, I could save maybe $400 monthly after basic expenses. At that rate, it would take me over 6 years to save enough money for college tuition, assuming costs didn't increase and I had no emergencies or setbacks. By then, I'd be 30 years old and starting my education a decade later than planned. I applied for additional jobs and tried to increase my income, but the opportunities available to someone without a college degree were limited and poorly paid. I looked into community college as a potential stepping stone, but even those costs were beyond my immediate reach. Student loans were available, but the debt required would be massive and would saddle me with payments for decades. Every option seemed designed to punish me for my parents' betrayal. The emotional toll was becoming unbearable. Former classmates would come into the restaurant where I worked, and I'd have to serve them while they talked excitedly about college experiences I should have been sharing. They'd ask why I wasn't in school, and I'd have to make up vague explanations about family circumstances and delayed plans because the truth was too humiliating to admit. But my parents weren't finished with their cruelty. 6 weeks after the wedding, they approached me with another opportunity to help the family. Brittany and Marcus had found a house they wanted to buy, but they needed help with the down payment. My parents had been researching my work schedule and estimated I could save about $500 monthly. Would I consider contributing that money to help my sister achieve homeownership? The audacity was staggering. They'd already stolen my entire college fund for her wedding, and now they wanted me to contribute my rebuilding efforts toward her next financial goal. They presented it as a family investment that would benefit everyone, suggesting that I could live with Brittany and Marcus temporarily to save money while I figured out my college plans. Of course, this arrangement would also provide them with built-in childcare when Brittany eventually had children, and my low-wage job could help cover household expenses. When I refused their proposal, they escalated their emotional manipulation to new levels. They organized a family dinner where my grandparents, aunts, and uncles were invited to discuss my attitude problem and selfish behavior. One by one, relatives stood up to lecture me about family loyalty and the importance of supporting each other. They shared stories about their own sacrifices for family members and questioned why I was being so difficult about helping my sister. None of them had been told the complete truth about what my parents had done. They knew vaguely that there had been disagreements about money and that I was resentful about wedding expenses, but they didn't understand that my parents had stolen my entire college fund without permission or discussion. My parents had carefully crafted a narrative where they were generous providers who had helped both daughters equally, and I was an ungrateful child who refused to appreciate their sacrifices. The community college compromise appeared briefly like a lifeline, then was snatched away just as cruelly. After weeks of family pressure, my parents finally agreed to co-sign a small loan that would allow me to start taking classes part-time while working. I enrolled in basic prerequisite courses and felt hopeful for the first time in months. But 3 days before classes started, they changed their minds. "We've been thinking about this arrangement," my father explained, "and we don't feel comfortable taking on additional debt right now. With Brittany's student loans and the extra wedding expenses, our finances are already stretched. Maybe you should work for another year or two and save up enough to pay for community college yourself." The extra wedding expenses he referenced were the ongoing costs of Brittany's lifestyle that my parents continued supporting. They'd bought her a car as a wedding gift. They were helping with her and Marcus's apartment rent. They'd given her money for new furniture and kitchen appliances. My stolen college fund had been just the beginning of their financial support for her life, while I was expected to fund my own education entirely through minimum wage labor. That night, I sat in my room calculating how long it would take to save enough money for even community college tuition, and the numbers were devastating. At my current income level, I'd need 18 months to save enough for 1 semester of part-time classes. A 2-year associate degree would take me nearly 8 years to complete. A bachelor's degree was so far out of reach it might as well have been on another planet. My parents had successfully trapped me in a cycle of poverty and limited opportunities while positioning themselves as the victims of my ungratefulness. But Uncle Robert had been quietly conducting his own investigation into our family's finances, and he was about to reveal information that would change everything. Uncle Robert's call came on a Thursday evening when I was studying community college catalogs and trying to figure out if there was any pathway forward for my education. His voice was tight with anger when he asked if we could meet privately the next day, away from my parents' house and potential interference. Something in his tone made me realize he'd uncovered information that went far beyond what we'd discussed before. We met at a coffee shop across town, and Uncle Robert brought a manila folder thick with documents that he spread across our table like evidence in a criminal case. For the past 2 months, he'd been conducting his own investigation into my parents' financial history, and what he'd discovered was even worse than either of us had suspected. "Your parents have been pulling these financial manipulation schemes for years," he began, showing me bank records and legal documents he'd obtained through his own research. The inheritance theft I mentioned was just the beginning. They convinced our elderly aunt to lend them $15,000 for home repairs that were never completed. They borrowed money from your mother's sister for a family emergency that turned out to be a vacation. They have a pattern of exploiting family relationships for financial gain. The documents painted a picture of systematic deception spanning over a decade. My parents had perfected the art of emotional manipulation, always presenting themselves as victims of circumstance who needed temporary help from loving family members. They'd target people during vulnerable moments, exploit their generosity, then disappear until enough time had passed for people to forget about the unpaid debts. But Uncle Robert's most shocking discovery involved my college fund itself. Through careful examination of bank records and receipts, he determined that my parents had actually spent significantly more than $32,000 on Brittany's wedding. The total cost had exceeded $58,000, meaning they'd not only stolen my entire savings but had also dipped into their retirement accounts and taken on credit card debt to fund her extravaganza. They could have given Brittany a beautiful wedding for half of what they spent, Uncle Robert explained, showing me vendor invoices and payment records. Every aspect was upgraded to the most expensive option available. The flowers alone cost more than most people spend on their entire wedding. They weren't just stealing your college money, they were using it as an excuse to live out their own fantasies of wealth and status. The evidence revealed another layer of betrayal that left me speechless. Marcus's family had actually offered to contribute significantly more to the wedding costs, but my parents had declined their offers in favor of maintaining complete control over the planning process. They could have accepted help that would have preserved my college fund, but they'd chosen to steal from me instead because it allowed them to play the role of generous providers without acknowledging their actual financial limitations. Uncle Robert had also discovered that Marcus's parents were privately questioning the financial wisdom of their new in-laws. They'd been shocked by the wedding's excessive costs and were concerned about Brittany's expensive tastes and apparent lack of financial responsibility. There were already tensions emerging in the new marriage as Marcus struggled to pay for his wife's lifestyle expectations while his parents worried about their son's financial future. Brittany's marriage is already in trouble, Uncle Robert revealed, showing me social media posts and public records that told a story very different from the happy honeymoon photos. Marcus's family is putting pressure on him to establish financial boundaries, and Brittany is pushing back hard. She expected marriage to mean unlimited access to his family's wealth, but they're much more conservative with money than she realized. The investigation had also uncovered my parents' current financial situation, which was far more precarious than they'd led anyone to believe. The wedding expenses had depleted their retirement savings and left them with significant credit card debt. They were struggling to make minimum payments while maintaining their lifestyle and continuing to support Brittany's ongoing expenses. Their house payment was behind, and they'd already borrowed against their home equity to cover immediate bills. They're in serious financial trouble, Uncle Robert explained, and they're looking for additional sources of income to bail themselves out. That's why they want you to contribute to Brittany's house down payment. They're not thinking about your future, they're trying to solve their immediate cash flow problems by exploiting you again. But the most valuable piece of information Uncle Robert had obtained came from an unexpected source. Marcus's mother, Claire, had been conducting her own quiet investigation into her son's new family after becoming concerned about their financial management. She'd reached out to Uncle Robert after learning about my situation through family gossip, and she was appalled by what my parents had done. Claire wants to help, Uncle Robert said, handing me a business card with her contact information. She believes what happened to you was theft, pure and simple, and she has resources to fight back that we don't. Her family has money and lawyers, and they're concerned about protecting Marcus from your parents' financial manipulation. They see helping you as a way to establish boundaries that will protect their son's future. The alliance forming between Uncle Robert and Marcus's family represented something my parents hadn't anticipated. Consequences from people with actual power and resources to fight back. They'd expected to face only resistance from me, a young woman with limited income and no legal connections. They hadn't considered that their actions might create enemies among people who could actually challenge them effectively. Claire had already consulted with her family's attorney about my situation, and while the legal theft might be difficult to prosecute, there were other avenues for recovery. If my parents had used fraudulent information to access my account or had misrepresented their intentions when making withdrawals, there might be grounds for civil litigation. Additionally, if they'd committed other financial crimes during their pattern of family exploitation, those might be prosecutable under state law. We're going to need documentation of everything, Uncle Robert explained. Every conversation, every promise they made about repayment, every manipulation tactic they've used. Claire's attorney wants to build a comprehensive case that shows a pattern of financial abuse, not just a single incident of poor judgment. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt like I had allies with the power to actually challenge my parents' behavior. Uncle Robert had the business experience and financial knowledge to understand their schemes, while Claire's family had the resources and legal connections to pursue real consequences. My parents had made the mistake of targeting someone whose new in-laws were both wealthy and principled enough to fight back. But we all knew that escalating the conflict would mean declaring war on my family relationships permanently. Once we started involving lawyers and pursuing formal consequences, there would be no going back to pretending we were a normal, loving family. My parents would fight dirty, and they'd use every emotional manipulation tactic available to turn other family members against me. "Are you ready for that level of conflict?" Uncle Robert asked gently. "Because once we start this process, your parents will do everything they can to destroy your reputation and relationships within the family. They'll paint you as vindictive and greedy, and some people will believe them." I thought about the 4 years I'd spent working multiple jobs while my sister enjoyed a carefree life funded by our parents' favoritism. I considered the dreams they'd stolen and the future they'd derailed. I remembered the humiliation of serving my former classmates while they discussed college experiences I should have been sharing. Most importantly, I realized that my parents were already planning to exploit me again for Brittany's house down payment and future needs. "I'm ready," I said firmly. They declared war on my future the day they decided to steal my college fund. Now it's time to fight back. The legal consultation with Marcus's family attorney, Jennifer Walsh, took place in a downtown office that radiated the kind of quiet power and expensive expertise I'd never encountered before. Claire had insisted on paying for the meeting, explaining that she considered my situation a family matter now that Brittany was married to her son. Jennifer listened carefully as I explained my situation, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions about my parents' exact words and actions throughout the theft and its aftermath. "What your parents did falls into several potential legal categories," Jennifer explained after reviewing Uncle Robert's documentation. While the theft itself might be difficult to prosecute criminally due to the cosigner situation, there are strong grounds for civil litigation under conversion of assets, breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially fraud if we can prove they misrepresented their intentions when accessing your account. The strategy Jennifer outlined was comprehensive and designed to attack my parents' actions from multiple angles. First, we'd demand full restitution through a formal legal letter that established a clear paper trail of their theft and my demands for repayment. If they refused or ignored the demand, we'd file civil litigation seeking not just the original $32,000, but also lost educational opportunities, emotional damages, and legal fees. But Jennifer's most powerful weapon was information she'd obtained about my parents' pattern of financial manipulation within the family. Uncle Robert's documentation of the inheritance theft, combined with records of other unpaid family loans, established a clear pattern of behavior that could support claims of intentional financial abuse. Multiple victims meant multiple potential witnesses and a stronger overall case. "Your parents have been getting away with these schemes because they've targeted family members who were too embarrassed or too loyal to pursue formal consequences," Jennifer explained. "But financial abuse is still abuse, and the law provides remedies for victims who are brave enough to seek them." The media strategy Uncle Robert had suggested was actually Jennifer's idea, based on her experience with similar family financial abuse cases. Local news stations often covered stories about educational theft and family exploitation, especially when they involved sympathetic victims like students whose college dreams had been destroyed. Media attention would not only pressure my parents to negotiate but would also warn other families about these types of schemes. "The threat of public exposure is often more effective than legal action," Jennifer noted. "Your parents have built their reputation around being generous, loving family members. Having their true behavior exposed publicly would be devastating to their social standing and could create pressure from extended family members and community organizations." While Jennifer prepared the legal groundwork, I focused on securing my own financial independence and stability. Using Uncle Robert's business connections, I'd found a better-paying job at a local accounting firm where my mathematical skills and attention to detail were valued. The work was more challenging than restaurant service, but it paid nearly twice as much and offered potential for advancement and skill development. I'd also found a small apartment that I could afford with my improved income, which would remove me from my parents' house and eliminate their ability to monitor my activities or interfere with my daily life. Moving out would also demonstrate to everyone that I was serious about independence and wouldn't be manipulated through threats of homelessness or family exclusion. The apartment hunting process revealed another layer of my parents' controlling behavior. When I mentioned looking for my own place, they immediately began sabotaging my efforts by calling potential landlords and sharing concerns about my financial stability and maturity. They told several property managers that I was irresponsible with money and likely to damage property or skip out on rent payments. Fortunately, Uncle Robert was able to co-sign my lease and provide character references that countered my parents' interference. But their willingness to actively sabotage my housing search demonstrated that they weren't just indifferent to my independence, they were actively working to prevent me from escaping their control. They wanted me trapped and dependent so they could continue exploiting me financially. Meanwhile, Brittany's marriage was deteriorating exactly as Uncle Robert had predicted. Marcus's family had discovered the true extent of the wedding costs and were horrified by what they considered frivolous spending. They'd also learned about my stolen college fund and were furious that their new daughter-in-law's happiness had been built on destroying her sister's future. Family dinners were becoming tense affairs where Brittany's spending habits were constantly questioned and criticized. The pressure was causing Brittany to become increasingly demanding and manipulative with our parents. She'd call crying about how Marcus's family didn't appreciate her, and our parents would immediately offer emotional and financial support. When she needed money for furniture, clothes, or entertainment, they provided it without question. They were spending money they didn't have to maintain their daughter's lifestyle while simultaneously trying to exploit me for additional income. Claire had been documenting Brittany's ongoing financial demands and our parents' responses, building a case that their theft of my college fund was just one part of a larger pattern of financially enabling Brittany while exploiting me. The contrast between their treatment of their two daughters was so stark that it supported claims of discriminatory abuse rather than just poor financial judgment. Marcus is starting to understand that he married into a family with serious dysfunction around money and fairness, Claire confided during one of our strategy meetings. He's talking about setting boundaries with your parents and limiting their access to our family's resources. Brittany is furious about this, which is causing constant arguments and stress in their marriage. The evidence compilation process was revealing details about my parents' deception that I hadn't fully understood before. They'd actually started planning to steal my college money months before Brittany's engagement, researching the legal aspects and calculating how much they could access. The family emergency story they'd told me was completely fabricated. They'd known from the beginning that they intended to spend every dollar on wedding expenses. Jennifer had obtained bank records showing that my parents had made inquiries about my account balance and withdrawal procedures as early as November, 3 months before Brittany had even announced her engagement. They'd also researched the legal consequences of accessing a co-signed account without the primary holder's permission, demonstrating that their actions were premeditated rather than desperate. This level of planning and deception elevates your case significantly, Jennifer explained. We're not talking about a moment of poor judgment under pressure. This was a calculated scheme to defraud you of resources you'd earned through years of hard work. The final element of our preparation involved building public support for my case within our extended family and community. Uncle Robert had been quietly sharing the true details of my situation with other family members, and several of them were beginning to question the narratives my parents had been spreading. When people learned that I'd worked 3 jobs throughout high school to save over $30,000, only to have it stolen without discussion or consent, their sympathies shifted dramatically. Claire had also been sharing information with her social circle, many of whom had children approaching college age and were horrified by the idea of parents stealing their children's educational funds. The story was resonating with other families and creating a network of people who understood that my situation represented a broader issue about family financial abuse and children's rights. Your parents have been successful because they've controlled the narrative, Uncle Robert observed. But truth has a way of spreading, and people instinctively understand the difference between family support and family exploitation. Once the real story gets out, they're going to find themselves isolated and facing consequences they never anticipated. We were ready to move from defense to offense, armed with legal expertise, financial resources, and growing public support. My parents had expected me to accept their theft quietly and continue being available for future exploitation. Instead, they were about to face the most serious challenge to their behavior they'd ever encountered. The war they'd started by stealing my college fund was about to escalate beyond anything they'd imagined possible. The formal family meeting I'd requested took place on a Saturday morning in my parents' living room, but this time I arrived with backup they hadn't expected. Jennifer Walsh accompanied me as my attorney, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and evidence. Uncle Robert came as my family advocate and witness. Most surprisingly, Claire attended as Marcus's family representative, her presence making it clear that this conflict now involved people with real power and resources. My parents' faces went white when they saw the entourage I'd brought to what they'd assumed would be another opportunity to lecture me about family loyalty and gratitude. They'd prepared for a typical emotional manipulation session, but instead they were facing what looked like a formal legal proceeding in their own home. Jennifer began by presenting a comprehensive timeline of their financial abuse, starting with Uncle Robert's stolen inheritance 15 years earlier and continuing through their theft of my college fund. She'd organized bank records, receipts, and witness statements into a devastating portrait of systematic family exploitation that went far beyond the single incident they'd tried to minimize. "Your pattern of behavior shows clear intent to defraud family members of their assets," Jennifer stated matter-of-factly. The theft of Stephanie's college fund wasn't a desperate decision made under pressure. It was a calculated scheme you'd been planning for months, as evidenced by your account inquiries and legal research beginning in November. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Jennifer presented bank records showing their early inquiries about my account. She showed email communications between my parents and wedding vendors that proved they'd committed to expenses they knew they couldn't afford. Most damaging was a text message thread between my mother and Brittany where they discussed using Stephanie's college money for wedding expenses as early as December, months before they'd told me about any financial emergency. My father tried to maintain their narrative about family support and temporary borrowing, but Jennifer cut him off with documentation of their current financial situation. She'd obtained records showing their mounting credit card debt, missed mortgage payments, and depleted retirement accounts. They weren't in a position to repay anyone anything, and they'd known that when they made their promises to me. "You spent $58,000 on a single party while stealing your daughter's entire educational fund," Jennifer continued relentlessly. "The luxury expenses documented here include $4,000 for flowers, $1,800 for a cake, and $3,000 for photography upgrades that served no purpose except displaying wealth you didn't actually possess." The room was completely silent as Jennifer presented receipt after receipt showing the excessive spending my stolen money had funded. Every ridiculous upgrade and unnecessary luxury was documented with price tags that made my parents' claims about emergency expenses look absurd. They'd chosen to steal from me not because they had no other options, but because it allowed them to fund fantasies of wealth and status without personal sacrifice. Then came the moment that shattered their remaining defenses completely. Claire stood up and presented information that neither Uncle Robert nor I had known she possessed. Marcus's family had conducted their own investigation into my parents' finances, and they'd discovered something devastating. "Your financial irresponsibility extends beyond family exploitation," Claire announced, her voice cold with controlled anger. "You've been systematically lying to our family about your financial situation while simultaneously asking us to contribute more to Brittany's ongoing expenses. The house down payment you've been discussing? You want our family to provide money for a home you can't afford while you continue exploiting Stephanie for additional income." Marcus's family had documented every financial request my parents had made since the wedding, and the pattern was clear. They'd been positioning themselves as temporarily struggling but fundamentally stable, while actually being in serious financial crisis due to their excessive spending on Brittany's lifestyle. They'd been trying to manipulate two families simultaneously, exploiting me for labor and income while extracting additional resources from Marcus's wealthy relatives. The confrontation escalated when Brittany arrived unexpectedly, having been called by our mother during the meeting. But instead of supporting our parents, she immediately began trying to distance herself from their actions to protect her own marriage. In a stunning display of family betrayal that shocked even me, she threw our parents completely under the bus to save her relationship with Marcus. "I never asked them to steal from Stephanie," Brittany declared, tears streaming down her face. "I thought they had the money saved already. When I found out what they'd done, I begged them to find another way to pay her back. I've been arguing with them about this for months, trying to get them to do the right thing. None of this was true, and I had text messages proving that Brittany had actively participated in planning how to use my college money for wedding expenses. But her willingness to lie under pressure revealed the true nature of our family dynamics. When faced with consequences for their actions, every person was willing to sacrifice the others to protect themselves. My parents' reaction to Brittany's betrayal was explosive and revealing. They began shouting about her ingratitude and demanding loyalty after everything they'd sacrificed for her happiness. In their anger, they revealed details about their financial manipulation that they'd been hiding from everyone, including additional loans from elderly relatives and unpaid debts to family friends. "We gave up our retirement for your happiness," my mother screamed at Brittany. "We sacrificed everything so you could have the perfect wedding, and now you're going to pretend you didn't know where the money came from?" The facade of loving, generous parents finally collapsed completely as they revealed themselves to be manipulative, entitled people who believed their children owed them unlimited financial support in return for basic parenting. They'd never viewed me as a person with rights and dreams, they'd seen me as a resource to be exploited when needed. Claire had heard enough. She stood up and delivered an ultimatum that changed everything. "Marcus's family will no longer have any financial relationship with you unless Stephanie receives full restitution plus damages for her lost educational opportunities. We will not subsidize your lifestyle while you continue exploiting your daughter. If you refuse to make this right, we'll ensure that everyone in both families and your community knows exactly what kind of people you really are." The threat of social exposure and family ostracism terrified my parents more than any legal consequences. They'd built their entire identity around being generous, loving family members, and having their true behavior revealed publicly would destroy the reputation they'd spent decades building. More importantly, losing access to Marcus's family resources would eliminate their hopes of continuing to exploit wealthy relatives for financial support. Jennifer presented the formal settlement terms we'd prepared. Full restitution of $32,000 plus interest and damages, totaling $42,000. Immediate cessation of any interference with my housing, employment, or educational plans. Public acknowledgement of their theft and formal apology to me and Uncle Robert for their pattern of financial abuse. And permanent exclusion from any financial decisions involving my future assets or income. "You have 72 hours to accept these terms," Jennifer announced. "If you refuse, we'll file civil litigation seeking triple damages, and Mrs. Walsh will ensure that your behavior receives appropriate media attention. The choice is yours, but understand that this is your only opportunity to resolve this matter privately." My parents looked around the room at the faces of people who had been their family just hours earlier and realized that they'd lost everything through their greed and manipulation. Uncle Robert was disgusted with their pattern of financial abuse. Claire was threatening social and family consequences they couldn't afford. Brittany had abandoned them to protect her own marriage. Even I, the family member they'd considered most controllable, was now backed by resources and allies they couldn't intimidate. That evening, my phone rang with their acceptance of our terms. The money would come from liquidating their investment accounts and taking a loan against their house equity. The public apology would be published in our local newspaper and shared with extended family members. They would sign legal documents ensuring they could never access my financial accounts or interfere with my future again. The victory was complete, but it came at the cost of permanently destroying our family relationships. As I listened to my father's defeated voice accepting terms that would financially devastate them for years, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I'd won the war, but the family I'd grown up believing in had revealed itself to be built on favoritism, manipulation, and exploitation. Still, for the first time in months, my future felt bright and full of possibilities again. The settlement check arrived exactly 72 hours after my parents accepted our terms, and holding it felt surreal after everything I'd been through. $42,000 represented not just the return of my stolen college fund, but also acknowledgement that what had been done to me was wrong and deserving of consequences. More importantly, it represented my freedom to pursue the education and future I'd been working towards since I was 16 years old. I enrolled at State University for the spring semester, just 4 months later than originally planned. Walking across campus for orientation felt like stepping into a life I'd thought was lost forever. The business administration program welcomed me back, and several professors who remembered my original application expressed genuine excitement about having me join their classes. For the first time in months, I felt like I belonged somewhere that valued my potential and ambition. The transition back into student life wasn't entirely smooth, but the challenges felt manageable compared to what I'd survived. I was older than most of my classmates and had real-world work experience that gave me perspective on the material we were studying. My years of working multiple jobs had taught me time management and financial responsibility that served me well in balancing coursework with a part-time position at Uncle Robert's business. The family dynamics that emerged after our confrontation were complex and painful, but ultimately healthier than the toxic patterns we'd been perpetuating for years. My parents' public apology in the local newspaper had been humbling for them but cathartic for me. Seeing their acknowledgement of theft and financial abuse in print validated my experience and helped extended family members understand what had really happened. My relationship with my parents evolved slowly from the wreckage of their betrayal. The legal settlement had established clear boundaries that protected me from future exploitation, but it took months of careful interaction before we could have civil conversations. They attended therapy, both individually and as a couple, to address the toxic financial behaviors and favoritism patterns that had nearly destroyed our family. We convinced ourselves that we were good parents because we provided for you and Brittany, my mother admitted during one of our first honest conversations after the settlement. But we never actually considered what you needed or wanted as individuals. We just assumed Brittany deserved more support because she seemed more fragile, and we took your strength and independence for granted. The acknowledgement meant something, even though it couldn't undo years of unequal treatment and the trauma of having my future stolen. Rebuilding trust would be a long process that required consistent effort from them to demonstrate genuine change. Some family relationships can survive betrayal and emerge stronger, but they require both parties to commit to fundamentally different patterns of interaction. Brittany's marriage had suffered significantly from the revelations about our family's financial dysfunction and the stress of Marcus's family withdrawing their support. The couple attended counseling and worked to establish healthy boundaries with both sets of parents, but the foundation of their relationship had been damaged by the deception and manipulation that had surrounded their wedding. I realize now that I was so focused on having the perfect wedding that I never considered the cost to other people, Brittany told me during an awkward but necessary conversation months later. I knew the money was coming from somewhere, but I didn't want to know the details because I was afraid they might interfere with my plans. I chose ignorance because it was easier than taking responsibility. Her acknowledgement of willful blindness felt more honest than her earlier claims of complete innocence, and it opened the door for us to begin rebuilding a relationship based on honesty rather than the enabling dynamics our parents had created. We would never be close in the way some sisters are, but we could potentially develop mutual respect and healthy boundaries as adults. Uncle Robert became the steady family relationship that provided continuity and support during my recovery and educational journey. His own experience with our parents' financial manipulation had given him insight into the long-term effects of family betrayal, and he was patient with my process of learning to trust again. He also became a mentor for my business studies, sharing practical knowledge that complemented my academic learning. The relationship with Marcus's family evolved in unexpected ways that enriched my understanding of what healthy family support actually looked like. Claire and her husband had insisted on paying my legal fees as part of their commitment to justice, but they also offered ongoing friendship and mentorship that had nothing to do with obligation or manipulation. They demonstrated how families could provide support without creating dependence or expecting exploitation in return. My academic performance exceeded my own expectations as I channeled the anger and determination from my family experience into scholarly achievement. The business courses felt relevant and engaging because I'd lived through examples of financial manipulation and poor decision-making that gave me practical insight into the theoretical concepts we studied. Professors noticed my unusual maturity and real-world perspective, and several offered research opportunities and internships. The experience of surviving family financial abuse also inspired me to begin helping other young adults facing similar situations. I volunteered with a local organization that provided legal aid and counseling for families dealing with financial exploitation, and I discovered that my story resonated with many people who'd experienced different versions of similar betrayals. Financial abuse within families is more common than most people realize, the organization's director explained during my training. Parents, siblings, and other relatives often exploit young adults' resources and labor while using emotional manipulation to prevent resistance. Your willingness to share your experience helps other victims understand that they're not alone and that fighting back is possible. The volunteer work became deeply meaningful as I met other students whose college funds had been stolen, young adults whose paychecks were being confiscated by parents, and siblings who were being exploited to support family members' irresponsible spending. Each person's story was different, but the underlying patterns of manipulation, guilt-tripping, and emotional blackmail were remarkably consistent. Through my advocacy work, I learned that my parents' behavior fit established patterns of family financial abuse that mental health professionals and legal experts recognized as serious forms of exploitation. Understanding the systemic nature of what had happened to me helped reduce my feelings of personal shame and responsibility. I hadn't failed to manage my family relationships properly. I'd been victimized by people who used their parental authority to exploit my resources and labor. The healing process involved recognizing the difference between healthy family loyalty and enabling dysfunction. True family support involves respecting each person's individual goals and dreams, not sacrificing some members' futures for others' immediate gratification. Healthy families don't steal from their children or manipulate emotions to avoid accountability for their actions. As I approached graduation with honors and multiple job offers, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that devastating day when I'd discovered my empty savings account. The trauma had been real and significant, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities I might never have discovered otherwise. I'd learned to advocate for myself effectively, build alliance with people who shared my values, and pursue justice even when it required difficult confrontations with people I loved. The financial settlement had given me back my educational opportunities, but the personal growth I'd experienced through fighting for justice had given me something equally valuable: confidence in my ability to protect myself and others from exploitation. I'd transformed from a victim of family manipulation into an advocate for others facing similar challenges. My parents and I maintained limited but respectful contact as I moved forward with my life and career. The legal boundaries we'd established protected me from further exploitation, while therapy had helped them develop healthier perspectives on family relationships and financial responsibility. We would never have the close, supportive relationship I'd hoped for as a child, but we'd achieved something perhaps more valuable: honest acknowledgement of past harm and commitment to different patterns going forward. Looking back on the experience now, I understand that my parents' theft of my college fund was ultimately a gift in disguise. It forced me to develop resilience, advocacy skills, and independence that served me well throughout my career and life. More importantly, it taught me the difference between people who truly support your dreams and people who see you as a resource to be exploited for their own purposes. The most important lesson I learned was that true family doesn't sacrifice some members' futures for others' immediate gratification. Real love involves supporting each person's individual goals and dreams, not demanding that some people surrender their ambitions to fund others' luxuries. When someone claims that family comes first, they should mean that family members protect and support each other equally, not that some people's dreams matter more than others. My story had a happy ending because I refused to accept injustice and found allies willing to fight alongside me. But not everyone in similar situations has access to the resources and support that made my victory possible. That's why I continue advocating for legal protections for young adults' educational funds and better recognition of family financial abuse as a serious form of exploitation. If you've experienced something similar, please know that you're not alone and that fighting back is possible. Have you ever faced family financial manipulation or had your dreams sacrificed for someone else's benefit? Share your story in the comments below, and let's build a community of people who understand that your future matters as much as anyone else's. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about overcoming family dysfunction, and share this video with anyone who might need to hear that their dreams are worth protecting. Remember that you deserve family members who support your goals rather than stealing your opportunities, and never let anyone convince you that accepting exploitation is the same as showing love. Thank you for watching, and I hope your family relationships are built on mutual respect rather than manipulation and favoritism. Your dreams matter, your hard work deserves protection, and your future is worth fighting for, no matter who tries to convince you otherwise.